The conference room on the 42nd floor had a view that cost money just to stand near. Floor-to-ceiling glass, the city sprawling below in a glittering grid of ambition and commerce, and inside silence. The kind of silence that follows failure. The nation's sharpest technical minds had spent 3 sleepless days staring at screens, running diagnostics, arguing in hushed, frantic tones, and arriving at the same destination. Nothing. In the center of it all stood Alexandra Reed, CEO of Vantage Systems, one of the fastest-growing financial technology companies in the country. She placed both palms flat on the polished conference table and looked at the room. Then she said the words that no one in that building would ever forget. $10 million to anyone who could fix it. The room held its breath. And then, from the very back row, a man in a wrinkled shirt slowly stood up. Nobody knew his name. Nobody thought he had a chance. But in fewer than 5 minutes, he would make every person in that room afraid to breathe. Alexandra Reed had built Vantage Systems from a concept sketched on a legal pad in a rented office in Boston to a company now valued at over $4 billion. She was 41 years old, relentlessly focused, and had never missed a deadline that she set for herself. The financial press called her a visionary. Her competitors called her terrifying. Both were accurate. 3 days earlier, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, Vantage's flagship product, a proprietary AI-driven risk assessment platform called Atlas, had begun producing outputs that made no sense. Not just slightly wrong, catastrophically, inexplicably wrong. Atlas was the engine behind hundreds of institutional investment decisions. Banks used it. Hedge funds relied on it. Several sovereign wealth funds had structured entire quarterly strategies around its projections. And now it was outputting figures that were off by margins so severe they looked like fabrications. The moment the first anomaly hit, Jonathan Blake, Vantage's chief technology officer, had assembled every available engineer and data scientist the company had. They worked through Tuesday night and all of Wednesday. By Thursday morning, the list of things they had ruled out was long and impressive. The list of what they had actually fixed was empty. Word reached William Hayes by Thursday afternoon. Hayes was the kind of investor who did not make calls, he summoned people. He had placed the largest single bet on Vantage in the company's history, and he did not exercise patience as a virtue. His message to Alexandra was clinical and precise. Fix the system within 24 hours, or the capital agreement would be reviewed. In the language of serious finance, reviewed was a word that meant destroyed. He added, in a postscript that she suspected he had enjoyed writing, that he was confident she would understand the urgency. She did. She also understood that Hayes had never once built anything, and that the size of his investment gave him leverage he had not earned. But this was not the moment to resolve that particular contradiction. Alexandra had stared at that message for a long time. Then she had walked back into the conference room, looked at the exhausted faces of the people who had given everything they had, and still come up short, and made the decision that surprised everyone who thought they knew her. She would open the problem to anyone willing to try. The reward was $10 million. The time limit was 1 session. The only requirement was that you could walk into that room and make a credible attempt. Her communications team argued against it. Jonathan Blake argued loudly against it. Alexandra listened to all of them, thanked them, and sent the announcement through the building's internal notification system anyway. Michael Carter read the alert at 7:43 in the morning, crouched inside a ceiling access panel on the 38th floor, his forearm pressed against a warm ventilation duct, listening to the rattle of a failing compressor that he had been trying to coax back to life for the past 40 minutes. The notification glowed on his phone screen. $10 million. System fault. Open challenge. 42nd floor. 9 o'clock. He read it twice, then slid the phone back into his pocket, and returned to the compressor. Michael was 38 years old. His official title was Facilities Maintenance Technician, Level 2, which was a formal way of saying that he kept the building alive. The HVAC, the electrical panels, the server room cooling, the backup generators. He had been in the role for just over 4 years. Before that, there was a gap on his resume that he did not discuss. A period of 2 years during which he had done very little of note, and had not particularly cared to. And before that gap, there was a life he had walked away from entirely. He lived with his 6-year-old daughter, Hannah, in a 2-bedroom apartment 20 minutes from downtown by bus. Hannah had her mother's eyes and her father's tendency to go quiet when something was bothering her. She liked puzzles and a battered stuffed rabbit named George that she had carried everywhere since she was 2. Michael packed her lunch every morning, walked her to the bus stop, worked his shift, and picked her up from aftercare most evenings. On the nights when his shift ran long, she waited for him in the lobby of the building with George tucked under one arm, usually asleep in the chair nearest the security desk before he arrived. He had learned to keep his world small. Small was manageable. Small did not ask things of him that he could not give. The reason for the gap, for the retreat into smallness, was something he turned over rarely and in private. He had been good at what he did, genuinely, unusually good. His work in machine learning architecture had attracted attention from firms that did not often pay attention to anyone. But the last project he had been asked to build, at a company he had believed in, had been designed with an embedded flaw that was not accidental. A data weighting scheme that would, under specific market conditions, generate favorable outputs for one class of institutional clients at the direct expense of retail investors who would never know what had hit them. Michael had flagged it to leadership. Leadership had explained that the flaw was a feature. He had refused to proceed. They had let him go on a Thursday with a non-disclosure agreement and a tone that made clear he would not find another door in the industry open to him. He had signed the agreement, gone home, and not returned to the field. That had been 6 years ago. Hannah had been newborn. Some losses become easier to measure when something new arrives that matters more. He had sold the equipment he no longer needed, moved to a smaller apartment, and found work that kept his hands busy and his mind in the present tense. The maintenance field asked nothing of him except that he show up and do the job in front of him. He had come to appreciate that more than he had expected to. He had not thought about that world in a long time. He was not thinking about it when he descended the ladder from the ceiling panel, signed off on the compressor repair in the maintenance log, and walked toward the elevator. He pressed the button for the lobby intending to start on a coolant line issue in the east stairwell. Then the elevator doors opened on the 37th floor, and Hannah walked in, George under her arm, wearing her school backpack. Behind her was the building's front desk coordinator, apologetic and slightly out of breath, explaining that Hannah's aftercare program had called a half-day due to a staffing issue, and that no one else had been reachable. Hannah looked up at her father. She did not say anything. She put her free hand into his. Michael stood in the elevator for a moment, holding his daughter's hand, looking at the floor indicator above the door. The number 42 was lit. By the time they reached the lobby, he had not said a word. He found a chair near the security desk, set Hannah in it with George and a granola bar from his jacket pocket, knelt down so he was at her level, and said quietly that he had something to do upstairs, and that she should wait right there. Hannah nodded, already pulling at the wrapper. She always understood him without needing the explanation. Michael straightened up, looked at the elevator, and pressed 42. The 42nd floor was a different atmosphere entirely. The conference room had the brittle, charged quality of a space where intelligent people had been embarrassed repeatedly and were still trying to recover their composure. Empty coffee cups and printed diagnostic reports covered every flat surface. The whiteboards along the north wall were dense with notation network diagrams, data flow charts, cascading error trees, the accumulated wreckage of every approach that had not worked. Jonathan Blake stood at the front of the room, his jacket over the back of a chair, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, his expression set into the controlled mask of a man who had run out of patience 3 days ago, and was now running on something closer to suppressed rage. Beside him, a team of senior engineers sat in various configurations of exhaustion. Henry Cole, who had been with Vantage for 7 years and was widely considered the most technically fluent person in the AI infrastructure division, had just finished presenting a proposed remediation approach that had taken his team 14 hours to construct. It was thorough, comprehensive, and would require 6 weeks and an estimated $3 million to implement fully. Alexandra had listened to the entire presentation without interrupting. Then she asked one question. Would it stabilize Atlas within the next 18 hours? Henry had taken a long breath and said, honestly, that he could not guarantee that. Alexandra had thanked him and asked him to sit down. The room understood what the silence that followed meant. 2 more proposals followed. A distributed systems consultant who had flown in overnight presented a re-architecting approach that was technically elegant and practically useless given the timeline. A data science team from the third-party auditing firm that Vantage had retained on an emergency basis presented 17 slides of analysis that concluded with impressive thoroughness that the problem was severe and complex. Neither presentation moved the situation forward by a single step. The room registered the cruelty of it and filed it away. Alexandra watched all of it. She had stopped intervening in the interpersonal friction because she was conserving herself for the problem that actually mattered, but she noted everything. She always did. It was 20 minutes past 9 o'clock when the door at the back of the conference room opened and Michael Carter stepped through it. He was still in his work clothes gray trousers, a light blue button-down shirt that had been pressed at some point in the past 24 hours, and had not survived the day, steel-toed work boots that left faint scuff marks on the polished conference room floor. He had his building access badge clipped to his belt. He looked like what he was. A maintenance technician who had taken a wrong turn. 2 of Alexandra's administrative staff moved to intercept him before he reached the table. One of them, a young man who managed conference logistics, stepped in front of him and asked, quietly but firmly, whether he was in the right room. Michael said he was there for the open challenge. The young man looked at him for a moment at the shirt, the boots, the badge, and then looked back toward Jonathan Blake with the expression of someone who needed direction. Blake did not lower his voice. We are not running auditions, he said from the front of the room. If this is someone's idea of a joke, I would ask that we not waste the next 10 seconds on it. There was quiet laughter from the far end of the table. One of the consultants leaned over to say something to the colleague beside him, and both men glanced at Michael with the particular brand of amusement that belongs exclusively to people who are certain of their own position. Michael did not change expression. He looked past the logistical staff member, past Blake, and found Alexandra Reed at the head of the table. He met her eyes and said nothing. Alexandra studied him for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. She had not survived a decade in an industry that did not want her in the room by being careless about her reads of people. There was something in the way this man stood unhurried, unafraid of the room's contempt, that was not the posture of someone who had stumbled in by accident. 5 minutes, she said. The room understood that she was speaking to Michael. Jonathan Blake started to object. Alexandra looked at him with an expression that had nothing in it except finality, and he stopped. Michael moved to the nearest open terminal. He did not ask for an introduction to the system. He did not ask anyone to explain what had already been tried. He looked at the diagnostic display for a moment and then asked, in the same even tone he used when requesting a work order, whether he could access the full input pipeline log from the 72 hours prior to the first error flag. Not the processed outputs, not the error summary report. The raw input log. Henry Cole looked up from his seat. That log has been reviewed, he said, not unkindly, multiple times. I understand, Michael said. I'd still like to see it. There was a pause. Henry looked at Alexandra. She gave a small permissive nod. Henry typed a command and transferred access. Michael sat down. The room watched him with a mixture of curiosity and the vague irritation of people whose time is being borrowed without consent. Jonathan Blake checked his watch twice in the first 90 seconds. What Michael was doing, which no one in the room could see the significance of yet, was not reading the error logs that everyone had been reading. He was reading the pre-processing layer. The step before the step, the quiet, invisible handoff between the raw data feeds and the AI engine itself, a section of the pipeline so foundational that it was rarely examined because it was assumed to be stable. Infrastructure people assume very little is stable. That was the difference. He had spent years working in spaces that high-status engineers did not think about, and that invisibility had taught him that assumptions embedded in infrastructure do not announce themselves when they go wrong. They simply allow everything built on top of them to begin drifting in directions that seem, to the people looking at the surface, completely unexplained. He found it in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Not a flaw in Atlas. Not a corrupted model weight. Not a failed API call. Not a server degradation issue. Not any of the 17 categories that the auditing firm had flagged as probable causes. A single data normalization subroutine, one among dozens, had been silently updated 12 days earlier during a routine maintenance push. The update had changed the behavior of a timestamp alignment function by a margin so small that it would never have appeared in a standalone test, but Atlas was a system that made decisions based on the relationship between thousands of data points over time. Feed a time series data with a systematic timestamp skew of 400 milliseconds in one specific feed, and the logical correlations it depended on started to drift. Not immediately, gradually, precisely the way the errors had emerged. The problem was not in the AI. The problem was in what the AI had been given to work with. Michael leaned back slightly. He looked at the screen for another moment, the way a person looks at something once they have understood it fully and are simply confirming what they already know.